Okay, guys, can I draw your attention? Okay, so we have a guest lecture today. We'll be talking today. So we are honored to have him here, Dr. Haider, among us today. And Dr. Haider Khan, as you know, he's a distinguished professor of economics at the Graduate School of International Studies at the University of Denver. And after graduating from Cornell, he started to teach at the University of Denver, and over the years he has taken home numerous recognitions as a notable economist and his commendable research in diversified areas. And he has worked as a fellow at the Hitotsubashi University. Did I pronounce it correct? Hitotsubashi University in Japan. He was a visiting scholar at the Tokyo University, and he was a traveling fellow at the Tilburg University at the Netherlands. And he was also a senior advisor to the Asian Development Bank for different economic affairs. And presently he is working as an advisor of the UNCTAD, one of the trade organizations, one of the arm of the United Nations who deals with the different trade issues. And he is also author of several books on economics. And especially for the student of my class, you might be interested about one of his book called Technology, Energy and the Development. So if you have any interest, I can give you his email address and you can contact him and get him. And today he's here to deliver a lecture from his research. It's not something hypothetical, something that what will happen to this country's economy. His research on from his global experience. And the title of this presentation is Economic Growth and Environmental Degradations, Evidence from BRIC countries. These are four the global emerging economies right now: Brazil, Russia, India and China. So he had some data which we'll present. So we probably will have around 40 to 45 minutes lecture, and which will be followed by, this purpose of this lecture that we'll have to initiate some kind of discussions. So with the rest of the time we'll have further discussions. Please feel free to ask questions. Even if you think it's a lame duck questions, you can ask, no problem. Okay, so Dr. Haider.
Thank you very much for a very kind introduction. I'm really glad to be here. I don't live too far from here. It's always nice to be on this campus because for a long time I have had many friends, including your professor here on this campus. I will discuss my own research and some other papers and work that I have done aside from this. But I want to put this in a much broader framework. And I can call it as a shorthand perhaps something like globalization, ecological crisis, and political economy. What are the characteristics and connections among these three? And under that rubric, I will try to discuss some of my own work and works by some other people as well. Last week, actually, I was at the UN in Geneva, which is a very nice town for those of you who know. And I was speaking in front of a large group of people from many countries. The topic was not exactly this. It was more on financial crisis and what's going to happen to the world if it doesn't end too soon. Then one person pointed out to me very politely that George Bernard Shaw, who was a very famous man when he was alive, maybe he's still famous now, and some of you may have read his work. George Bernard Shaw once said that if you put all the economists end to end, they still would not reach a conclusion. That's a very witty way of putting things. Some people just say that economics is a dismal science and they are done with it, they think. But I pointed out that Shaw actually was perhaps not so right, because economists actually reach many conclusions, and even a single economist can reach many conclusions. One of the stories about President Truman is that when first the Council of Economic Advisors was formed in this country after the Second World War during the Truman administration, he, after a while, was in despair, and he said, could I please have a one-handed economist? And people asked why. He said, well, those people are always telling me on the one hand this and on the other hand that. So I never know what I should really believe or how I should decide, which of course was what he wanted to do, because he is famous for having said that the buck stopped there meaning his table. So anyway, economists can reach many conclusions, I want to assure you. But in this particular area, I think we are now reaching a fairly wide consensus. And that consensus happens to be a bit scary. Just to kind of highlight a few things, I will go through some of the salient facts from a book a friend of mine wrote. But let me just give you the plot of the lecture, because this is not a detective story, maybe half detective story. I can tell you the plot. Okay, so I start with some warning bells that many people are sounding to show that there's a fair degree of consensus both in what we might broadly call environmental science or environmental sciences and ecological economics today. Then I will argue that the standard approaches that have been followed in the past and that are being followed by international organizations among others and some governments among others are really flawed. In particular, I will criticize a very influential report by Nicholas Stern and his colleagues from UK. It's called the Stern Report. It became very famous. And argue that their approach, which is more or less business as usual, is not really going to work. And we need what I call an ecological political economy approach with hard empirical estimates, some of which I will show you here if I have time, from our work on these BRICS, which stands for Brazil, Russia, India, and China. But also we have estimates for other countries, advanced economies in North America and Western Europe, and more broadly European Union countries. Then I will briefly discuss something which is called Jevons paradox. William Stanley Jevons was a 19th century economist who pointed out something very interesting, that as efficiency increases, the scale also increases in the economy. And therefore, at the end, you probably have to run as fast as you can just to stay in the same place as Alice in Through the Looking Glass. Now, I will also point out that there are distributional consequences. Inequality, poverty, and growth are actually intimately related, and they are issues of organization of our economic life and our political and social institutions. So I will then argue that we need a two-pronged approach. One would be green technology and production, and the other one would be conservation and downsizing in rich countries and sustainable egalitarian development in poor countries. So I'm giving you my conclusions ahead of time. So if you have to go early, you know what you are missing maybe. And then I will discuss something by a group in Stockholm, Sweden. They call themselves Global Scenario Group. And they discuss how the transition might take place from where we are to where we might want to be with all the ecological problems that we have. And finally, I will present you what I think is my own paradigm based on the work that I and some others have done. And I call this a post-Gandhi Schumacher paradigm. You are probably familiar with Schumacher, who wrote the famous book Small is Beautiful, and Gandhi. How many people here know about Gandhi? Oh, quite a few. So, well, Gandhi is famous for his doctrine of nonviolence, which influenced Martin Luther King, among others, a great deal. But he was also I would say, an ecological economist before the word or phrase was coined. But I call it post Gandhi Schumacher because small is beautiful, certainly, and we should focus on that. But we also need a mixture of small and medium and large because we do have economies of scale and other benefits of modern and postmodern systems of production that we cannot easily forgo, especially for the poor countries. So we have actually a number of choices here, I think. So at the end, I hope to leave you with something of a positive message, which requires very hard work by dedicated people, especially young people, but also people of other ages as well. So that's the plot, and I will now begin. Let me just cite for you from a book called The Ecological Revolution, some of the salient facts that I think we have wide consensus on right now. For example, there is now a virtual certainty that the critical threshold of a 2 degrees centigrade, which is 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, increase in average world temperature above the pre-industrial level will soon be crossed due to the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. This came from the IPCC, International Panel for Climate Control, in 2005. Of course, their 2007 report is even more alarming. So clearly, now there is consensus that this kind of warming will have very portentous effects. Secondly, there are growing worries in the scientific community that the estimates of the rate of global warming provided by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which in its worst case scenario projected increases in average global temperature of up to 5.8 degrees centigrades, which is 10.4 degrees Fahrenheit, by the year 2100, may prove to be too low. For example, results from the world's largest climate modeling experiments based in Oxford University in Britain indicate that global warming could increase almost twice as fast as the IPCC has estimated. Experiments also at the International Rice Research Institute and also elsewhere show that with each 1 degree centigrade increase in temperature, rice, wheat, and corn, the major cereals, the yields of these cereals could drop by 10%. So for 1 degree centigrade increase in temperature, yields can drop by 10%, and that could happen everywhere, in highly productive areas as well as not so productive areas. Also, fourthly, it is now increasingly believed that the world is approaching peak crude oil production. The world economy is therefore confronting more constrained oil supplies despite a rapidly increasing demand. All of this points to a growing world energy crisis and mounting resource wars. Of course, some of my earliest work dealt with energy problems, and I'm still working on that. I have another paper on China and its energy problems, which you can probably find on the web. Indeed, we need to focus much more than we have been on both alternative types of energies and how to move away as rapidly as possible from increasing fossil fuel use. As if all these were not enough, the planet is facing global water shortages due to the drawing down of irreplaceable aquifers, which make up the bulk of the world's freshwater supplies. This poses a threat to global agriculture, which has become a bubble economy based on the unsustainable exploitation of groundwater. 1 in 4 people in the world today do not have access to safe water. And of course, this is heavily concentrated in the poor countries, but it's not concentrated just there alone. I finished and published another paper with a student of mine who is now doing her PhD in Boulder. She's from China, Yibei Liu, and it's on the water management issues and ecological economics of water in China. Once again, China is really facing a huge crisis. And these are things that are not unknown actually to Chinese government, which is trying its best to take steps to correct it, but it's very difficult because China is a very large country. But the same problem exists everywhere in the world today. Another alarming fact: 2/3 of the world's major fish stocks are currently being fished at or above their capacity. Over the last half century, 90% of large predatory fish in the world's oceans have been eliminated. And then we have related to that in the same category, the general species extinction rate, which among others Gus Speth, very famous environmental scientist who may still be the dean of the School of Forestry and Environmental Science at Yale, has done a lot of work on this. The species extinction rate is the highest in 65 million years, with the prospect of cascading extinctions as the last remnants of intact ecosystems are removed. Already the extinction rate is, in some cases, as in the case of bird species, 100 times the benchmark or natural rate. Scientists have pinpointed 25 hotspots on land that account for 44% of all vascular plant species and 35% of all species in 4 vertebrate groups, while taking up only 1.4% of the world's land surface. All of these hotspots are now threatened with rapid annihilation due to human causes. And then National Academy of Sciences published a study in the year 2002, and this is truly alarming if true. The world economy exceeded the Earth's regenerative capacity in 1980, and by 1999 has gone beyond it by as much as 20%. This means, according to the study's authors, that it would require 1.2 Earths, or 1 Earth for 1.2 years, to regenerate what humanity used in 1999. Of course, we have only 1 Earth, and we are not behaving very well with respect to that 1 Earth we have. Several years ago, I think Jared Diamond wrote a book called The Collapse, which looks at Easter Island and what happened there, among other things, and that book became very popular. That shows that even at the popular level, there is a great deal of unease and awareness of some sort, but not probably of the kind that we really need, which is the scientific kind of awareness that all of you are familiar with. So with that as the background, let me now talk about the standard approach. Standard approach that economists follow is basically market-oriented and market-based. And this is something that I find actually unbelievable. And I find it unbelievable because I am a very well-trained economist. To be completely frank, when I was first learning economics, I actually didn't think it was real. You know, it was just kind of dealing with intellectual puzzles and models, demand and supply, and seeing where they intersect, what kind of equilibrium existed. And it is fun, actually. It is a lot of fun to deal with all those things. Economics is a very sophisticated science in that sense. But as anybody who is truly scientific in spirit knows, there are 2 things about science you need to recognize. One is that science actually is based on abstractions from reality. If you have to just describe reality concretely, you don't need science. There's just too much there to describe. So science actually abstracts, simplifies, and then somehow this is supposed to be wonderful. Why? Because there is a second characteristic of science, which is that with this right kind of abstraction, you can actually classify a lot of diverse phenomena under just one set of laws or one kind of theory, and then you can experiment and observe. And this is very important. Observation and experiment, those are really the stuff that makes science different from speculative matters like philosophy. And most honest scientists are actually very open and quite ethical about measurements and experiments and connections between theory and experiments. And good economists, because they are good scientists, are also very honest. We know, first of all, that even in an idealized situation, for an equilibrium to exist in the market requires amazing number of heroic assumptions. So it's a very nice textbook exercise, but it's not the real world. When you go from this science to the real world, as some of us have tried to do, you find that you have to take into account all kinds of imperfections of the real world. And one of the biggest imperfections in the real world is what we call externalities, or to be more precise, in this case, negative externalities. When a company produces in its plant something with chemicals, it dumps chemicals, say in a river, and the river flows downstream, and that chemical is born and it pollutes all the way downstream. So the company really doesn't have to pay for it unless you force the company. If you leave things to the market, market has no way, no mechanism really to correct this. And this is a case of what we would call market failure because of negative externalities, in this case, this chemical dumping. And there are many, many examples of these sorts. There are also externalities due to lack of information or asymmetries of information, which are very, very serious. The Nobel Prize winning economist Joseph Stiglitz has done very important work in this area and has pointed out that just because of the asymmetry of information and incompleteness and imperfection of information, a market system really hardly ever works the way it's supposed to. Among other things, this is one of the major problems with the working or really malfunctioning of financial markets. If I had time, I could actually go onto this, but I have written a book on that too, so you can read it. The point is that markets really do not function as the textbooks say they do. And especially in case of environmental matters, they are far from well-functioning markets. And in fact, part of the problem is that when markets do function in the way that they're supposed to function, if they are truly free, then they're also free to pollute. And they're free to really screw up the environment, which is really what has happened, which is what is happening in many countries, including China today. As China becomes more and more of a market economy, it also becomes more and more of an environmentally degrading economy, among other things. The other problem, this is the third point, is that even when you increase efficiency, the scale increases. This is something that Jevons pointed out in the 19th century. He was studying the question of coal, whether coal would run out, and Britain, since it was an industrial power then based on coal, would face problems. He didn't foresee that oil would replace coal, but he did correctly foresee, in fact see and foresee, it was happening even then, that as efficiency increased, the scale of the economy also increased. So in terms of net throughput, you really didn't save. In fact, you were actually using more of nature's inputs than you had before. But Jevons, since he lived in the 19th century, didn't find much wrong with it. Most people in the 19th century were like this. And looking at some of the so-called analysis that appear in newspapers and the way some of our politicians talk, I feel that most of these people are still living in the 19th century. That is one of the real problems of our time, unfortunately. These people are in a time warp. So there is that Jevons paradox, and it's very important. Furthermore, as I said, there are distributional consequences. Suppose you pollute. Well, it has various effects. Among other things, it affects people's health, and people have to spend more money as a result. Even if we assume that income is equally distributed in society, which of course we know is not the case, certainly not the case here, and even many egalitarian societies like China have become much more unequal in the last 35, 40 years than they used to be. So societies are actually unequal, and usually poor people suffer more from this because they cannot choose the location where they work so easily, they cannot choose the location where they live, and there are all kinds of barriers. But if you ignore all that and be very conservative and assume that everybody suffers equally, then you can show by using the mathematical axioms for measuring inequality that inequality actually will be more if you took that into account, subtracted the cost of pollution from everybody's income, and looked at this resulting income distribution and the inequality in this resulting income distribution. I have several papers and book chapters on this if you're interested. For poverty, it's a little more tricky, but you can show that under most plausible assumptions, poverty would also be more. So one side benefit of doing something about environment is that you can reduce this kind of unintended distributional consequences. We will say they are unintended because I don't think anybody really conspires to hurt the poor in this way. But that is what really happens, and this is what science tells you. So we do need good scientific analysis, I think. Now, what about the BRICS countries? We have, over time, have seen technological improvements in the richer countries. So in terms of actual, let's say, per unit pollution, per unit emission of any pollutant, you know, the CO2 equivalent, which is 6 gases, or water pollution, or noise pollution, any of these, the developed, advanced countries actually have achieved a great deal of efficiency with both energy use and general production methods. But having said that, it must also be recognized that their ecological footprint is still much larger than other countries. Only China may be beginning to have an ecological footprint which is going to compare with the ecological footprints of the larger industrialized countries, which we always hear have moved into service, which is true to some extent, but still you need infrastructure, you need transportation, and huge amount of the energy is used every day, every hour in all these places. And one of the problems, as an aside, of using fossil fuel is the increasing dependence on resources from the Middle East, perhaps from Central Asia, perhaps even from Africa, and that is leading to a very strange geopolitical competition, increasing the threat of war, certainly regional wars, if not a global one. So with all the headaches that we have, that's another one to worry about. But this Brazil, Russia, India, and China, these economies have been developing for quite some time. India and China are actually the more prominent ones in terms of their production, their GDP growth. But Brazil and Russia are also important. Russia, Brazil, and China also happen to be producers of energy. India produces some, but not enough. So we have here a situation where clearly these people want economic growth. They want rapid economic growth, and they think that is desirable. But with growth, they are using up a lot of energy, and with energy, of course, they are using a lot of CO2 that is being released in the atmosphere, and CO2 equivalent, as I said. So we used some equations to estimate these, and if we can go to these equations, which may be a few pages down the line, you can see that their growth rates varied. Russian growth rate was very erratic. And there was a time in the 90s when Russian growth actually was negative, and Russia actually became a very innocent kind of country in terms of pollution, because it wasn't producing as much, so it was not polluting as much. But today it does also a fine job of polluting. So what we have done is to estimate CO2 emission there with GDP growth and a number of other control variables. And we have also estimated energy consumption functions. And we have done many different ways of estimating these things. If you are interested, you can read the paper. And we found that, and this I think is part of doing good science, that varying assumptions in all kinds of ways and giving these countries every chance to actually get away, you still find that increasing growth is leading to increasing energy and increasing amounts of CO2 emission. There was kind of this mythical idea, and maybe I can draw this curve for you. This was called environmental Kuznets curve. The idea was that if you graphed growth here and any kind of negative externality for environment, say CO2 or SO2 or any of those things, other things, the idea was that first pollution would increase with growth, but then there would be a turning point. There would be an inverted U-shaped curve. And so it's almost like saying, well, you leave things to the market, leave people alone, and after they have grown enough, then they will turn down. Which, of course, even empirically is suspect. After you look at the numbers carefully and the work that people have done, carefully you find that things don't look quite as neat as they did to the authors of these papers. There are some very good papers that we have referenced in our work here that you can read, which again goes to show that good science is really absolutely essential. Because there is this phenomenon which I would call scientism, that if you just say something is scientific, people believe it. It has become another religion. But good science really is very critical. You have to look at the theory, whether it is plausible, whether it is consistent, whether it coheres. You have to look at the way that specific hypotheses are drawn from the theory, and then you have to look at the data and what actually was done, and if it makes any sense. So I think that BRICS economies certainly are not going to turn down like this unless policy measures are taken and they are implemented in the right way. And there is a problem because these countries are still quite poor, or large numbers of people are poor in these countries. And it would be quite sanctimonious to say that they should now be into conservation while the consumption and production in developed countries would proceed apace. That seems simply hypocritical. So you have to find a way for these countries to be able to find a path towards sustainable development. And at the same time, there must be conservation and downsizing in rich countries, because as I said, even with all the efficiency, you have increased scale and also an increase in the ecological footprint. So that requires, drawing upon my previous research that I mentioned, also a much more egalitarian distribution, much more equitable distribution, along with measures to conserve and along with production through green technology. Why egalitarianism is important is actually worth thinking about, because there is this ideology somehow that inequality helps growth, and it's the rich people who make the world go around. Well, we just saw, to mention the financial crisis, that rich people necessarily are not the smartest. They may be greedier than the rest of us, but they are not necessarily smarter than the rest of us. And we really do need to rethink this whole proposition. And if you really look at the scientific literature in economics, you find both kinds of growth patterns that are inegalitarian and growth patterns that are egalitarian. With egalitarian growth and education in sustainability and more of a community-based awareness raising, as well as emulation in both consumption and production towards sustainability, I think an egalitarian society would have a much better chance of averting the kind of disaster that we are heading towards. The work that has been done by the Global Scenario Group I mentioned before in Stockholm, Sweden, gives some credence to what I just said. This Global Scenario Group, and I am somewhat critical of their work as well, they have published a number of really interesting reports. The most interesting one is called The Great Transition. The Great Transition. Well, this is the transition out of the present predicament, we hope, to a better future, and that's indeed what they are telling us. But they divide up the scenarios that are possible, the whole possible futures, into 3 segments. One possibility is just to stay in conventional worlds, as they call it. And conventional world actually comes in 2 forms. One is market forces, the other one is policy reform. The second scenario, or second set of scenarios really, because each one of them has 2 sub-scenarios, is called barbarization. And according to their modeling, if you just let market forces work, then you end up with barbarization. That is, it's basically everyone for himself or herself, every country for itself, and we have predatory wars of resources, and we have pretty much close to a scenario like collapse in Jared Diamond's book. It can lead to complete breakdown, or it can lead to something called fortress world. So compared to these things, according to these wise people, whose science definitely is unquestionable, we should really try some policy reform. Policy reform would be essentially Keynesian kind of reform, governments doing what they are doing today to avert the financial crisis, although if you ask me, I would say they are not doing all the right things, and that will really come back to haunt us pretty soon in the future. But there is still hope. I'm an optimistic person. So if these things really do not work, and the policy reform itself can only get us part of the way, and that is still very far from what we need to do to avert the crisis scenarios that might result from the global warming and other ecological challenges, then we have to look at other possibilities. And this is what they call great transition possibilities. And there are again 2 scenarios there, only one of which they discuss. And this one is called New Sustainability Paradigm. The New Sustainability Paradigm is interesting because it has a lot of the right stuff, I would say. But it also engages in a lot of wishful thinking, I would say. And let me just read you a summary of what they really think can happen. And then I will present the alternative that I mentioned. Okay, the essence of the new sustainability paradigm is that of a radical ecological transformation that goes against unbridled capitalist hegemony but stops short of full social revolution. It is to be carried out primarily through changes in values and lifestyles rather than the transformation of social structures. Advances in environmental technology and policy that began with the policy reform scenario, but that were unable to propel sufficient environmental change due to the dominance of acquisitive norms, are here supplemented by a lifestyle wedge. In the explicitly utopian scenario of the new sustainability paradigm, the United Nations is transformed into the World Union, a true global federation. Globalization has become civilized. The world market is fully integrated and harnessed for equality and sustainability, not just wealth generation. The war on terrorism has resulted in the defeat of the terrorists. Civil society, represented by non-governmental organizations, the NGOs, plays a leading role in society at both the national and global levels. Voting is electronic, poverty is eradicated, typical inequality has decreased drastically, dematerialization is real, as is the polluter pays principle. Advertising is nowhere to be seen. There has been a transition to a solar economy. The long commute from where people live to where they work is a thing of the past. Instead, there are integrated settlements that place home, work, retail shops, and leisure outlets in close proximity to each other. The giant corporations have become forward-looking societal organizations rather than simply private entities. They are no longer concerned exclusively with the economic bottom line, but have revised this to incorporate environmental sustainability and social ecology as ends, irrespective of profit. Of course, if all that happened, they will no longer be the kind of corporations they are today. So 4 agents of change are said to have combined to bring all of this about. 1 is giant transnational corporations, 2 intergovernmental organizations such as the United Nations, the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and World Trade Organization. 3rd, civil society acting through NGOs. 4th, a globally aware, environmentally conscious, democratically organized world population. I think the 4th is certainly essential, very, very essential. But the whole thing here reeks of utopia because it doesn't address at all what it would take, for example, to change the corporations to be what they envision the corporations to be, or for the World Bank or IMF or even the United Nations, which is slightly better, to be much better than what they are today. One of the dark sides of the so-called globalization, which has at least 4 components, economic, political, technological, and cultural communicative. The economic side definitely is that the so-called neoliberal doctrine advocated by IMF, the World Bank, the regional banks. I have worked in one of them at least, but I know the others as well. This ideology actually is leading us down the path of ecological decay and destruction much faster than otherwise would have happened. And of course, it hasn't helped promote much growth. It has increased inequality tremendously in the world. And now, of course, we have a global crisis, global economic crisis at our hands. So it would be very, very difficult to argue that given the present constitution and composition of both the international organizations, which are called intergovernmental organizations more correctly, and the transnational corporations, as well as many national governments, we need something very, very different. Instead of dreaming about these things, we should be asking ourselves what we can do today, what kind of movements we can build, what kind of solidaristic outlook we can have, what kind of ecologically sound practices we can have both at the local and at the national, regional, and global levels. So this is, I think, what might lead to a new global social and political movement, the beginnings of which are already there. In Porto Alegre, for example, there are models of sustainability in small parts of the world, including a part of India called Kerala, and even Cuba is practicing now organic agriculture, which is not just a response to crisis, but really started much earlier on there. So we do have a chance, I think, to work with green groups in this world, but to be very aware of the political economic underpinnings, because all these local efforts are good, but unless we can really understand the political economy of inequality, poverty, and growth correctly, we will not be able to make the transition to what I have called earlier this post-Gandhi Schumacher paradigm. At any point, society actually produces a surplus, and this is the surplus that we have to use to rectify many things. The problem with tremendous inequality in society is that most of this surplus actually gets siphoned off towards luxury consumption or speculative type of non-investments, really, and waste quite often. So we need a kind of transformational transition which is not just going to be small is beautiful, which will involve the larger corporations as well, but the corporations must be brought under democratic governance. And we must have governments that are truly accountable to the people, and also accountable to people beyond their borders, because especially the most powerful countries in the world affect people far beyond their borders. And therefore, it is only a matter of reality to point out that they have responsibilities, and their citizens also have responsibilities. So we need a global solidarity movement, the beginnings of which I think are already there. So it is not utopian to talk about this, but I think it is something that is very challenging, and it requires very hard work by many people all over the world, and by good politicians, because politics is necessary. In fact, it is even primary, I would say. And we do need good politicians rather than just self-serving, opportunistic, greedy, corrupt ones. So I think it is really important not to be cynical about politics, not to be cynical about economics, because if you're cynical, you have already given up. And that is purely defeatist. That is the surest way to make that disaster actually happen. So I would say that we should be open-eyed. We should recognize that the world is not a very good place right now, but there are good people in this world, and there are people who can bring their goodwill, their energy, their intelligence, and work together with other people in a non-egoistic manner, which would be truly Gandhian. And therefore, I am optimistic, and I certainly try to live my own life in keeping with these principles, however imperfectly, and I know that you do too. So I hope we can have a very good discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay, now the floor is open for discussion. So we have, I think, still about 25 minutes time. So please start. Yes.
I'd like to, the graph you had that showed Russia was a negative economic decline in the 90s.
That was in the 90s, yes.
And how you said that it had an impact on their environment as well.
Well, it was because you can actually write down an equation showing precise relationship between growth and use of inputs that have environmental consequences. So usually for a country like Russia, it is quite huge because their technologies were much more energy wasting and polluting technologies. So when they become idle, they actually use a lot less. And therefore, Russia actually was doing very well environmentally, although it was doing very poorly economically during the early 90s especially.
So I guess my question would be, in the current recession that we're in, do you think that there's been enough of a decline in production that you can see a difference?
Oh yeah, you can, but it's not enough, clearly. And when we come back up again, which we will, although I don't think very soon, it can go on again the same way. And that is not the way that obviously we want the world to go.
So is that data you look forward to finding to kind of prove a point to say that, look how our economy is tied in closely to damages to the environment then?
Oh yes, definitely. The way that we have approached the whole question of growth really has left out a lot of these environmental issues. But as I said, the problem is more complex because the world is uneven. And even within one economy, in this country, for example, it's uneven. There are pockets of poverty in the US, as we know, and they're increasing. And those people need jobs. Hopefully, we can create good jobs for them rather than jobs that would use very primitive, relatively speaking, forms of production. I remember when I was an undergrad, I once worked in a textile mill in Seneca Falls, upstate New York. And it was amazing. It was like a 19th century mill. I don't know if those still exist today because textiles industry has become pretty much dead in this country. But there is great deal of unevenness even here. And if you look at the world as a whole, there is even more unevenness.
As far as inequality are concerned, if wealth was more evenly distributed, especially in third world countries, what would be the effect of them spending more money or having a higher standard of living, environmentally?
Yes.
If everyone is able to, get very, very simple things, such as toilet paper, or toothbrushes, or electricity, would that have even more of a negative impact on the environment? Or would it even itself out?
It's a good question. I think if you look at the ecological footprint once again, in terms of stratum, different strata in society, clearly people who are in the wealthy segments in every place have larger ecological footprints. Even when they say they're environmentally more conscious, they actually use more stuff. So even if they're using green technology, they're still using more stuff. And in third world country, it is truly obscene, because you have the rich people who have first world living standards, using actually technology that is not so green. So they have, compared to the poor people, they are much larger ecological footprints. And then if you do more fine analysis, I have done some work also with my colleague in the Netherlands, Jeffrey James. We wrote a book together, as well as many articles we published together, where we look at different socioeconomic groups. We did it for India and for Indonesia. And we found that if you redistribute income, what happens is that poor people who get a little more use more of the necessary stuff, like food items, or medical care that they don't actually usually have much of. And they usually use, for most of this extra expenditure, goods that are produced by more labor-intensive technologies. And although not all labor-intensive technologies are ecologically friendly, many which are quite traditional actually are, especially in the food-producing sector, not so much in the manufacturing sector, perhaps, always. So you have to be very, very careful and cautious in your understanding of these things, and you have to, I think, change the structure of production along with distribution. It can't be just one thing. You have to do several things at once. Yes?
They talk about, they expect that the market will drive or that the economy drives the market, and what we're spending on will help drive environmental influences. And we're seeing that it really isn't. So would it, like an environmental tax of some sort, actually kind of help regulate that to try and force the market to control the environmental issues?
Yeah, it certainly is one thing, but given the enormity of our problem that I hope I made somewhat clear, this is something necessary, but it's like a Band-Aid. It's going to help, definitely. I think if you have effluent fees, for example, or even cap and trade, you do under the existing institutional structure, you are going to be able to do something better than if you did nothing of this. But it's not going to be enough, because the challenges are tremendous. And if we think that the market system with some tinkering will solve this problem, we are just fooling ourselves. And here I think there is one, I think he had also a question, and then you don't have a question? Okay. No. Okay, let me just finish this thought, and then there was an article in Harper's Magazine called The Myth of Market, I think. And the author points out something very interesting, that in a secular society, market actually becomes like a theological idea. People don't believe in God, but market becomes like an impersonal God. And somehow you want to rely on market without understanding what it is. When you do understand what markets are, you see both what they can do, and you also see what they really can't do. Well, to put it in the context of international organizations, I think the really best parts of international organizations, especially the UN system, are those which do scientific work that is socially and globally relevant. And IPCC is one example. And not, of course, these people are not permanent members, workers in the UN. I have been actually within the UN bureaucracy to know that there's a lot of waste, as in any large bureaucratic organization. But this waste also exists in private corporations, something that people don't seem to think about or worry about. We should worry about both. And getting rid of the United Nations obviously is not going to solve our problem if we get rid of all these other parts of the UN, as I said, IPCC, Food and Agricultural Organization, the part of it that actually works, WHO, World Health Organization, parts of UNICEF. So we have to be very, very careful, and if we focus on science alone, we should see at least two things, I think. One is that in every society there is, at any point in time, a capability in science and technology. So we need the best estimate of that capability of science and technology. And it's done very well in the United States, for example, or Japan or EU, where people are talking about nanotechnology and biotechnology and information technology and how this could be brought together. In 2005, I gave a talk in Bangkok, and I tried to actually see how these technologies could converge. And I came up with an idea that I call somewhat grandly superconvergence. And I predicted that by the year 2050, they will converge together. And that would lead to a lot of benefit. Now I, of course, wonder if we have that much time. But clearly, in the advanced developed countries, technology is going to be much less of a problem. But in the other parts of the world, we don't have the capacity. And there's a lot of help that is needed, especially in Africa. And there, I think the world has an obligation. And the international organizations have an obligation. And they have to be pressured from below. And much of foreign aid, again, is misused or abused. But some of it can be used, actually, to increase this kind of capabilities. And so I strongly support this kind of move. But again, I cannot say this enough. It all needs really pressure from below by well-informed, well-organized citizens all over the world. We need both small and large-scale changes. I think example is always a good teacher, but I think this is also the time for especially this country to reach back into its own past, not the official past that business histories and other kinds of official histories give us. I read a book some time ago. I bought it for 80 cents. Public library was getting rid of it, so I bought it. It's actually a history of various kinds of simplicity movements in America. And if you go back also to Christianity, which is one of the traditions certainly in the Western world, in its essence, Christianity also is a doctrine of simplicity and life of simplicity. And there are people like Amish, who live very simple lives. I have actually studied them. I used to be in Ohio for some time in my life, and I used to go visit them in the Ohio-Pennsylvania border, also in Pennsylvania. A lot of skills, of course, have been lost by ordinary people. In 1930s, if you go back and read the history, a lot of people during the Great Depression went back to the countryside. Their relatives took them in. A lot of those people had skills in farming. They actually had farms that were functioning. They could grow vegetables and other things, and they could be somewhat self-sustaining. And then, of course, the government came and started various kinds of programs. Roosevelt went much farther than Obama did. Obama doesn't seem to have that kind of courage or vision. But there were people in this country at that time who wanted actually much more integrated kind of planning and land use of urban space as well as rural space, townships that would be much more ecologically sound. All kinds of things happened in this country, during what some people might consider to be a very dark period. And truly people were suffering, but people are also thinking and acting. So I think we need to draw on all these resources that we have. And we need to use the ideas that people are coming up with today, building intentional communities, maybe consciousness raising in all kinds of cultural institutions, starting with family and neighborhood to educational institutions. I think educators have a great responsibility, and not just to talk, but to act and show. Again, I think examples work much better than words. And I do have this faith that if you start with your own life, and this is again the Gandhian in me talking, as Gandhi did, over a lifetime you can see change in yourself. And then when you talk about change, you actually act change. And people then are convinced. And after, this is again tipping point idea, that after sufficient number of people are there, then things have a momentum of their own. So we do have to be patient, but we have to be very determined, I think. And I do not at all underestimate the problems today. I can see that there has been a real slide in the last 30 years even towards more self-centeredness, towards being more egotistical and egoistical and uncaring. But I think it can be reversed. Let's see, you and then you.
I'm thinking about human population growth, and knowing that human population growth is happening exponentially, and that the majority of that population growth is happening in the developing world. And as the population grows, more and more and more people for those resources to be distributed among. So I'm wondering, how important is it, or is it at all, to get human population growth under control and stabilized in order to achieve some of these goals of sustainability?
Well, certainly I think from a grand ecological perspective, where you actually treat all species equally, and even inanimate matter as well as you do human beings, we have monopolized too much of the planet's resources. But I think the problem is not just population itself, which I would like to be stabilized at a smaller level than it is today, just so that we can make more room for other species. But really the wealth and income distribution, because the wealthy 2% on this planet actually have much larger ecological footprint than the rest of us. And this is the real problem, and this is a problem that people don't seem to want to face up to. There was, yeah.
Back to the topic of how do you get people to change? I kind of feel that there's a mixed message, or at least a retreaded message to the consumers who are out there actually purchasing things, and that's what we're trying to ultimately change. We have this idea of sustainability. It's being thrown around quite a bit. And the UN defines sustainability as using no more than is necessary so as not to hamper future generations.
Yeah, it's a very human-centered approach, among other things. Yeah.
That's
yeah.
conservation.
Yeah.
We had conservation movement back in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah. We have to downsize, actually, I think. We cannot keep growing at the scale that we are growing.
But isn't it the same thing? We're just repackaging it with a new brand?
That's often the case. I think that is often the case. I hope it's not the case with me and people like me. There are serious ecological movements, and there are serious people in those movements who recognize, the point you just raised. And so Brundtland Commission, for example, which says a lot of good things in its 1987 report, ultimately really does not face up to the challenge of changing our values, changing our institutions within which those values are expressed. And that's what we must do. Yes?
Kind of building off the last two questions here. Earlier you referenced that the Earth had exceeded its resource capacity in 1999.
We need 1.2 Earths, according to this estimate.
Do you think that the idea of scarcity was created, like the overpopulation theory, the idea of scarcity was created to, like, I don't know, serve consumers?
Well, I don't believe generally in conspiracy theories, but I think certain theories kind of appeal to people who may not want to consider any other things. So yes, to people in Rockefeller Foundation, which actually supported a lot of this research in social science especially, Population Council, it seemed like a fine idea that if only poor countries would control their population, then everything would be fine, and you don't really need to think about problems of imperialism, militarism, greed, profit, large corporations, the Rockefellers. I don't think it was a conspiracy, and truly good scientific work was done and has been done. Among other things, the guy who just died, who through Rockefeller Foundation went to Mexico and developed hybrid varieties that led to 5 or 10-fold increase in productivity, and other people like that. Well, they actually were doing fine things, but people who are focusing exclusively on population and population in poor countries, and of course there are even more fascistic people than these kind of liberal researchers in Rockefeller Foundation and other places, like Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, who didn't want uneducated people to have children because they would be less intelligent, and he gave incentive for educated people in Singapore to get married. So there are those people too, and they are not all in the first world. They want to join the first world. Indira Gandhi, one of her worst things was forced sterilization during a particularly obnoxious period of her rule. So we have these instances, so it's not just white men's fault, but it's a kind of ideology that parades itself as a theory, and then you don't look at other explanations, other aspects of the problem, and this is a much more general and serious problem than just the population issue, I think.
At the very beginning, you're talking about green technology. You mentioned that green tech. I'm wondering what kind of leap in technology do we need to make in order for green technology to really be viable? Is it storage? Is it transmission? What is the latchkey that we're missing that really is going to turn everyone over onto green technology?
I don't think there is any one thing, but if you had to point to some essential strategic aspects, I think one is certainly energy. Because that underlies all modern production systems, or all production systems. I mean, human energy is also energy that we get through our metabolism. But I think the problem today is the following. It is really impossible to replace fossil fuels. We can go from oil to gas, but we are still talking about fossil fuels. And in order to go to renewable energy, we need probably a transition time of 2 decades at least. So that is a part of reality that we have to face. In the meantime, then I think we have no alternative but to downsize the production in advanced countries in the world, especially in all kinds of what many people like me would consider to be unnecessary lines of production. And the second aspect would be infrastructure, transportation and building, physical infrastructure especially, where we can do much better than we have done. Things are already much better than they used to be. But in this country, one problem, for example, is public transportation. We also have, and this is something that I was completely taken aback by, because when there was energy crisis during the days I was a student, people were driving small cars, and I thought, wow, this is great, people never will go back to those large gas guzzlers. And of course, companies said they improved, the efficiency, and of course, fuel efficiency was improved, and then we had all these big cars and SUVs with 1 or 2 people in them, which still goes on. So I think we need to really focus on energy and energy consumption as a beginner, as a strategic focus, and then we can move simultaneously to other areas. Well, globalization, as I said, has at least 4 aspects and maybe more, and much of it really has been hyped up. People have been sold, by and large, a false bill of goods. It has not benefited the majority of the people on this planet. It actually has hurt them. It has hurt the most vulnerable people and is still hurting. But I do not think going back and building a kind of fortress, you know, in each country and being autarkic is going to help. I think what we need is a more level playing field, a recognition that rhetoric doesn't amount to reality, that free trade is not really free, that financial systems are unstable, that you cannot solve endemic problems of poverty simply by opening up your markets. But protectionism, by and large, is in many ways worse, especially by developed countries. If that really starts happening, it will be like the 1930s. So in that sense, I'm actually a supporter of globalization of certain sort. A globalization in certainly better transmission of information, better communication, better understanding of other cultures, better sharing of knowledge and skills. Those are absolutely the kind of globalizations that we need, and not much of that really has happened. If anything, knowledge has become even more concentrated in certain parts of the world and within certain regions and certain socioeconomic classes. So we need to break those down and truly globalize those areas. And for the rest, I think we need a much more selective, much more carefully regulated, and by that I mean truly democratic regulation and democratic governance of corporations, public organizations. Even the civil society organizations need oversight. Just saying the magic word civil society doesn't solve any problem. A lot of NGOs are fairly corrupt, and you need to make them accountable as well. So we do need actually a much more aware and active, energetic, vigilant global citizenry.
Okay, I think we have to stop now. Okay, thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Dr. Havel.